fifth essential of biblical stewardship is investor. Our instructor will be Vince Burley, CEO of Vidant Financial. Vince has over 30 years of experience in the personal and institutional financial services industry and is a certified financial planner. Prior to co-founding Vidant Financial, he was the Chief Strategy Officer and Chairman of the Investment Policy Committee for Ronald Blue & Company, where he led the efforts to develop the principal reasoning investment philosophy that the Vidant indices utilize. Prior to joining Ronald Blue & Company in 2000, Vince was a founder and principal with Atlantic Capital Management, LLC, where he served as managing partner. Vince and his wife Susan have been married since 2002, live in Atlanta, Georgia, and have 3 children. Please welcome Vince Burley.
It's great to be here. Chuck, always great to be with you. Thank you for having me. We've been through a lot together. I want to thank Ann, too, because my wife comes to conferences when I say Ann Bentley's going to be there. So thanks, Ann. So today we're going to talk about investing. I think it's appropriately placed because if you work and you earn income and you give and calibrate yourself to the one that helped provide that and you spend less than you earned, you have savings. Investing is what you do with those savings. If you don't have any savings, you really don't have an issue with investing. And frankly, that looks like most of the world. Most of the world does not have an investing problem because most of the world doesn't have any savings. 70%, as this chart indicates, have less than $10,000. Of that 70%, about half of those people don't have anything. There's about 5 billion adults, so you can put the numbers to that. The red column represents what share of the world's wealth, household wealth, is actually controlled by that amount of people. So 70% of the people control about 2.7% of the world wealth, and then you go all the way up to the $1 million plus, and you see you have the 0.7% controlling about 45% of the world's wealth. Those people have investment problems. The 1% idea is real. It's very concentrated. So why does Scripture have so much to say about riches and wealth? And that's what we're going to talk about. See, I think Christian investment goals is more about not just managing your earthly treasure wisely, but not letting your earthly treasure manage you. I've been advising, I left Ronald Blue about 1.5 years ago. I spent 20 years at Ronald Blue advising 6,000 of the most wealthy Christians in the world on how to help them with their money. The biggest issues I saw were actually the second half of this sentence, not the first half. So we're going to spend some time on managing how to do this wisely, but we're also going to spend some time on not letting the treasure manage you. And so the first part of that is going to be managing your treasure wisely, and I'm going to start with the purposes for investing. You see, once you have savings, you've heard this throughout this conference, you actually have the ability to actually have savings for the future in case there is a need that you have later that's unexpected, or that one that you planned for. Now that makes sense. There also is wisdom in how to do that. We're going to cover that today. But that's different. Look at the order of which I just put this. It's protect and grow savings. You don't see anything here about investing to get rich. When you save for money that you're going to actually need in the future, you got to first think about protection and then a prudent level of growth. The issues associated with the next thing, growing the kingdom, is impact. So wisdom is at the top. How do you actually save your money wisely to protect it and grow it prudently? The second thing is then this impact. Now, there's about 1.5 million adults in the world that have more than $10 million in worth. They have more than what they're ever going to need. And I've met with a lot of these people. I would say, and we're not going to touch on this a lot unless the Q&A opens this up for people that have way in excess of what they need. But there's a whole different set of decision-making that takes place there. In other words, We just don't keep growing barns to keep growing barns the same way. Once the barn is full and you said how much is enough, then you got to start thinking about kingdom building with that wealth. But everyone should have some issues associated with this first part, and that's why we're going to spend most of the time there. We're going to go over principles. I'm not going to give investment advice today. Principles are guidance factors. They guide you in how to make wise decisions. They help you probably look through an investment process to say, does this reflect wisdom or not? Principles, again, are not practices, so there's wide latitude in actually how you apply this. There's no scripture that says, here's how you actually invest. There's more scripture actually on how not to let the treasure manage you than actually how to manage your treasure. So there's going to be these principles, and these principles that we're going to talk through are something that I developed in 2010 when I was with Ronald Blue as a chief strategy officer and head of the investment policy committee. So you can take notes, but this white paper actually is available to you at their website. You can download that for free, and a lot of the things that I'm going to be talking about today are reflective of these principles. It's the same principles also that the investment company that I now lead employs in all their decision-making processes. So let's talk about principles. Principles of applied wisdom. The world is uncertain, but not chaotic. Okay, we live in an uncertain world since the fall, but there still was intelligent design in the way the world works. And that's where principles and wisdom comes in. So applying wisdom, principles can improve the probability of successful outcomes. You've heard all of these principles on how to spend, on how to save, how to work. These are all principles. They do not guarantee outcomes. Notice, they improve the probability of successful outcomes. And let me give you an example. No one here wants to get into a drunk driving accident. You can improve your probabilities greatly if you don't drink and drive. But it doesn't mean somebody else isn't going to drink and drive and have an accident with you. We live in a fallen world. And so all we can do is improve the probabilities of successful outcomes by following principles. There's no guarantees. And thank God there aren't any guarantees, because otherwise our faith would be misplaced. So let's talk about some environmental principles. Principles of uncertainty. Provision against an uncertain future is a reason to save and invest. This is why we save and invest. It isn't to create more wealth, even though you may be given that talent to do that, but in the purposes we're talking about today for investing, it is because of this that we save and invest. It's because of the fall. There's scarcity. I would proffer this to you. If there wasn't the fall, would there be any reason to save? Scarcity took place because we fell, and then all of a sudden you plant a seed and you don't necessarily get a crop. So that's why you save, because you may not have a crop, right? So that's why we save, and the Bible is really a handbook for me for after the fall. It's a handbook that says how do you get back reconciled with your God, and it also says what it's like to live more like in a desert than in a garden, right? So here's a good example. We heard this verse last night about go to the ant, no sluggard, observe her ways, and be wise, which having no chief, officer, or ruler prepares her food in the summer and gathers her provision in the harvest. All right, it makes sense in a fallen world because you may actually not have a harvest every year to save. The other environmental principle is the principle of instability. Markets and economies are not stable, and provision against uncertainty may fail. Diversification helps manage this type of risk. I think a good analogy here is weather. So we just talked about uncertainty. We could have like a cloudy, somewhat rainy day. We could have a sunny day. We could have a windy day. And that's probably within the normal range of distribution of outcomes in your weather, right? But you can't predict every day what the weather is going to be like. In addition to that normal distribution of outcomes, there's these outcomes called tornadoes and hurricanes and earthquakes and typhoons, right? Those don't happen as often. But we do have those in markets and economies, and most everyone remembers 08, 09 as one of those incidents. That's going to happen. just like we're going to have a hurricane, or it's like we're going to have a typhoon or a tornado. That's going to happen. It's not going to happen within the normal distribution range, but those things do happen. Diversification helps manage against that risk, because in Ecclesiastes 11:2 it says, divide your portion to 7 or 7 to 8, for you do not know what misfortune may occur on the earth. This is telling us there's going to be misfortunes in the earth, and you don't know where that's going to happen. So you don't concentrate your real estate holdings in the Panhandle or in Indonesia. You diversify that if you want to make sure you're going to preserve against that. Let's transition now into what I would call the wealth principles. These are principles that help us know how wealth is created and where wealth is created and how to make good investment decisions. This is the principle of productivity. Wealth is created as a result of human productivity. Productivity is a combination of human creativity and natural resources. Now, a lot of people will say, where does wealth get created? Why does markets go up? Why does markets go down? All of these things. The reality is that unless somebody is actually producing more than they can consume, there is no capital. There is no investment. And for a long period of time in the world, there was no such thing as capital. People lived every day on what they could actually create themselves. So savings is something that comes about because we are so productive that we can't possibly consume everything that we create. So where does that take place? That takes place, well, let me just say this. This is because we are made in God's image. And God's image is an image of a productive and creative God. So we're like Him. So He creates the earth, and then He says, be fruitful, multiply, and replenish the earth. So while we have the fall that puts us in a bad spot, we also still carry God's image, the image of productivity and creativity. And then we can do things like take sand and make them into computer chips. Pretty amazing stuff that when people actually are incented and protected to be productive, they can do amazing things because of the likeness that we're made out of. Now, where does that happen? Where that happens is where leadership and governance significantly influences the productivity of people they lead. Environments with greater civil and economic freedom tend to provide increased fertile ground for investment. So where do humans produce more? Where leadership and governance incents and protects those people. Now, the best thing for me to do here is to give you a picture of what that looks like. Does anybody know what that is? Yep, that is the Korean Peninsula at night from outer space. Now, one is fairly light and one is fairly dark. And one would say, what's the difference there? Well, they have more natural resources in the south and the north. Not true. Or, it's a different race, or it's a different, they're just been given different. It's the same place. There's only one thing that divides that line. That's leadership and governance. Because one leader is incenting people to actually be productive and protect their rights, and the other one are using the people for the leadership and governance. North Korea generates about $1,300 per capita in domestic product, economic growth. North Korea about 11,600. It's nearly 10 times the productivity levels in the south than in the north. We're told about this in Proverbs, when the godly are in authority, the people rejoice. But when the wicked are in power, the people groan. There's good kings, there's bad kings. There's good leaders, there's bad leaders. There's good models, there's not so good models. There's no perfect model. But when you're moving in that direction, that's when you see more productivity. I've thought a lot about this conference in the series. I told you about how investing was good at the end. But this can help you, I think, understand how an economy and investments work. It's laid out perfectly. Because every one of the households in an economy that is working produces, right? They're doing work. So they're making production of something, goods and services. They give to the church. The church becomes the social fabric of a country if the church is being the church. Right? So the more we can give to that, you create stability in an economy when the church is the church. We save because we spend less than we earned. But when we're spending, we're actually fueling that economy. We're buying the goods and services that help keep the businesses in place. And then when we have something in excess, unlike some economic theories that say spending is the way you create wealth, we invest. And we invest in those businesses. And those businesses then have capital to go hire more workers. Now, the faster that wheel goes, the faster the economy goes. And the way that works is that then your investment returns are highly correlated to the economic growth that's taking place in that economy. And the more people are actually in, more circles there are, is how you get a growing economy. So whenever you're thinking about making an investment decision, you're making an investment decision into people, you're making a decision into what kind of environment you're investing in, and that's going to dictate what type of returns and the stability of those returns that you're actually going to have. Now, how do you make a good investment decision? Because you may find the environment perfectly that you want to invest in, but you have to test the price, because investors and markets are not always rational. Opportunities or risks can be identified when a disciplined valuation process is used to determine the inherent value of an investment. This is probably the biggest mistake that investors make, is not buying at the right time and not selling at the right time. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, but this is the key to actually making a wise investment decision. For which one of you, when he stands to build a tower, does not first sit down and calculate the cost to see if he has enough to complete it? So the principal summary is, first, there are no guarantees. Anybody that starts telling you guarantee, I have something guaranteed for you, warning, Will Robinson. No fortune tellers. Anybody that says you need to invest this way because I know the markets are going to do this or I know this is going to happen, warning, Will Robinson. Diversification is not a way to create wealth. Diversification mitigates risk. You have to expect a lower return if you're going to diversify than what you otherwise could have had, because something's always going to do better than a diversified portfolio. It's the one that does the highest in your diversified portfolio. Wealth creation takes work. Any investment opportunity that comes your way that does not actually have some sort of association with productivity levels is probably speculation. It's not an investment. Bitcoin might be the best example of that. And the price isn't always right. You have to test the price to make sure that the price fits for what you're actually trying to accomplish. So let's put a little meat to this bone. How do you invest to protect and grow your assets? The first question you need to always ask yourself is, when are you going to need the money? Now, unlike a lot of people that work in the advisory committee, they start with, what is your risk tolerance? I don't find that to be the best first question. My first question is when do you need the money back? And I'll help you make a good investment decision, because you should tie the time horizon of the need to the time horizon of the investment. Short-term investment need, short-term investment. Long-term investment need, long-term investment. And then you have to set realistic return goals on the time horizon. So let's go through some examples of this. On the left, you see something like a car purchase, college education, some early retirement years, and later retirement years. Well, your car purchase, you might have that in 1 to 2 years, versus your long-term retirement, later years, is 16 years out. You don't have the same investment strategy for 1 to 2 years versus 16 years. You have different portfolios for different time horizons. So think through again, what would you do in 1 to 2 years? Because in 1 to 2 years, you're going to need $35,000. So what does that kind of strategy look like? For over on the left, that's the short-term strategy, 1 to 2 years. Your primary goal is to maintain principal. So you have $35,000. You want to make sure you have the $35,000 when you go buy the car. What's your primary source of risk? Volatility. You know what volatility is? Volatility is when things go up and down every year. So an investment can go up and down maybe 1% versus maybe buying stocks. Aggressive stocks could go down 50% in any 1 year. So you wouldn't put your money, $35,000, into something that could go down 50% in 1 year. The hard part is it could have gone up 50% in the year that you were actually in the bank. And that's when contentment becomes a problem. But that is how you think about actually investing in the short term. And when you go out long term, you'll see on this primary, the goal, you're starting to actually want to think about inflation. Now, the people in Latin America know a lot about more inflation than we do here, because they have a very volatile currency environments down there. But here's in essence what you can expect when you're talking about a dollar of inflation, or with your dollar of inflation. In America, that's about 3% per year your dollar erodes. So next year, your dollar purchasing power is more like 97 cents. And then next year, it goes down to 94 cents, and it goes down to 91 cents, and you start eroding the purchasing power of your dollar. Well, over a long period of time, that can eat into your dollar, and all of a sudden, you may have $1 million, like it says you needed out there for your long-term retirement needs, but $1 million in future value, not in present value. So if you don't invest to at least keep up with the 3%, you're losing purchasing power every year. So inflation becomes your biggest risk over the long period of time. What is the thing that you're not concerned about over long periods of time? Volatility. All right, so volatility shouldn't bother you in the short term, because you're not going to need that money for 16 years. Right? So that's not a risk that you should be paying attention to. It's a risk that we often pay attention to because we don't like to see our treasure, especially going down. The only volatility investors don't like is downward volatility, right? They love upward volatility. So you have to think about things like stocks when you think about longer term. So tie your investment actually to the time horizon when you need it. And understand investments have trade-offs. There is no investment that has everything. There's going to be a trade-off that you're going to have. So lower returns are okay for short-term needs. That's going to have to be a discipline of contentment and self-control when you see markets going way up and you're only getting 1% to 2%. Volatility is okay for long-term needs. Don't freak out when volatility happens next year when you don't need the money for 15 more years. But it's a hard thing to do, but volatility is okay for long-term needs. And no investment has high returns and low volatility, other than ones that end up in a Ponzi scheme and somebody ends up in jail. Anybody that starts talking to you about returns with no volatility that are above market is a time, again, for you to run. So that all seems somewhat simple, right? Let's transition into now not letting the treasure managing you, because this is the issue that I have seen and is proven through a lot of studies, is the issues associated with the buying and selling of investments at the wrong time. So the issue is associated with fear of missing out and the fear of loss, both interesting, called fear. All right, so this is what happens. There's actually a whole study called behavioral finance. Behavioral finance is actually studying investors, because studying humans that always do the wrong thing at the wrong time is pretty interesting science, right? We buy high and sell low. That's what we do on average as investors. Now, does anybody think that that's a way to make wealth? Right? You don't make wealth that way, but that's what we do. Now, here's what happens. Is you're going along and all of a sudden you see this investment and someone telling you about this investment and they tell them about your returns and you're making all this money and it's time to jump on that bandwagon because you're missing out, right? So that happens near the top. Some people get it really right and get it right at the top. but usually it's on its way up. All right? That's called buying high. And then the investments start to go south, and they start declining. And all that money that you have, that you've saved so hard through spending less than you earn, that you now have in your account that you worked hard for, you're not going to want to lose it because it's going down in value. And so you want to get off that bandwagon to not lose any more. That's called selling low. I'll tell you the degree at which this actually, they've done studies, it's amazing, this behavioral finance science. When you're making paper gains over there when you're making money, the same place in the brain that is stimulated by paper gains is the same place that cocaine and morphine stimulate. It's a high. Now, when you're actually losing through paper losses, the part of the brain that's actually stimulated is mortal danger. Same place. It's the fear of death is the same place as when you're losing your wealth. It's no wonder we're challenged with this decision. So neuroscience has said a lot about this, but it's actually proven out. There's this company called Dalbar that actually does research. And this is the blue line is the actual investors' returns versus funds that they were investing in's returns. Now, how can you get less than almost half of the returns at the funds you're investing in over 5, 10, and 20 years? Because you bought into the funds at the wrong time. You bought in when it was high, and they sold out when it was low. This is the average investor returns in the funds that they were investing in. This proof that investors, as a large, buy high and sell low and don't actually even experience. So the easiest thing to do is just being able to control your emotions. Now, this is what I call preaching time. So, got to take a drink of water for this one. This is what I've watched for 20 years. These decisions by Christians, great Christians. And I think the church is, the teaching on this has been really challenging, I think. Because I think most of the teaching around this has been that stewardship reflects you doing better than your neighbor, which could be otherwise termed covetousness, or the fear of loss, the anxiety of losing your treasure. Now, what is that treasure? The treasure, I think, is back to the first commandment that says, "Thou shalt not have any other God before me." And Jesus says in Matthew 6, I think, that the God you need to watch out for is money. You will worship one of two masters, either God or money. You can't serve both. Now, why money? I think money is the best replacement for God. It's the best idol man has created because it provides two things that God wants to provide for us: security and provision. But that's a lie. It doesn't provide security, and it doesn't always provide provision. So Paul tells us then what to do about that. Now, 1 Timothy 6:17 is a verse that you need to camp out on. So I'm going to read it. I don't have it up, but if you want to pull it up on your Bible or wherever, it says, "Command those that are rich in this present world not to be arrogant or put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but in God, who richly provides everything that we need." That is a powerful verse. It's what Ronald Blue was founded on. It's what changed my life. We are called to command to the rich. It's interesting to think of the rich as a rich ministry field, but that's actually how I see it. The rich are vulnerable. So that's why he says command. Remember the rich young ruler? Why did he walk away from Jesus? He had too much. And then it goes on to say that it's easier for a rich man to go through or a camel to go through an eye of a needle than a rich man to enter the gates of heaven. This is a tough issue, wealth. Right? So the Beatitudes was all not about blessed is the rich. This is a real challenge that I've seen in people's lives because it becomes the replacement for God. And it's a bad replacement because he says, command those that are rich in this present world not to put their hope in riches which are so uncertain. He's already told us, remember the principle of uncertainty? It's uncertain. It's a bad God. It's a bad, false God. And when you think about what God's saying right after that, he's saying, but put your hope in me because I am a good God, and not just I'm going to give you provision, I'm going to give you everything you need for your enjoyment. This was tested so greatly, I think, with the Israelites on their march to the Promised Land. And remember how much manna they got? One day. And if you saved it, it rotted. He was teaching them, you can depend on me. You don't have to depend on your manna. That doesn't mean don't save, but don't put your hope in it because it's going to be uncertain. Now, how does that tie back to the investing decision? I truly think that we are easily prone to fall in love with our money. You don't have fears of losing something if you're not that much in love with it. My son, he used to play a lot of video games. Too much time playing video games. I used to say to him, your video games have become your God. He goes, no, it hasn't. I said, well, when I take it away from you, you don't react very well. He goes, what do you mean? I said, well, if I take your homework away, you don't throw a fit. You only know what you really love and treasure if it's taken from you. So thank God for volatility. So did investment professionals stand up here and say that? Not probably to get your money, but thank God for volatility. Otherwise, our hope would be in that wealth. Thank God for volatility. So how do you know? Let's do a treasure test, not a treasure chest. A treasure test. Where's your treasure? Where are you spending your time? How much time are you looking at your account? How much time are you looking at your account relative to others' accounts? What about your decision making? Are you changing out advisors, changing out funds? Are you always looking to try to do something a little bit better? How about your emotional state of mind? Depression, euphoria. 08, 09, I had a first row seat to a lot of families with a lot of wealth. One individual I remember very distinctly, he had about $50 million. He wanted it invested very aggressively, and as you can imagine, through that period of time, it didn't do very well, and it was down to $30 million. Now, rightfully so, $20 million paper loss is not something you jump up and down and be happy about, right? But do you not sleep? Do you separate from your wife? Do you come in angry, yelling at people? So he kept asking, what should I do? And the CEO said to him, if I were you, I'd give it away. Give it away? I just lost $20 million. He goes, yeah, if I'd lost $20 million and I felt that way, I certainly wouldn't have anything to do with that $30 million that's still there. He didn't walk away very happy, similar to the rich young ruler. He had too much. So what does a successful Christian investor look like? Get your goals clearly understood. When you're going to need them, what you're going to need them for, what are some realistic expectations for your returns, the wisdom based decision-making process are those principles. Ask yourself if those principles are being employed in the decision-making you're considering. Considering a Christian advisor to hold you accountable. Not hold you accountable to making more than everybody else. Hold you accountable to your spiritual and emotional and financial goals. I know there's a few of them in here. Raise your hands if you're a Christian financial advisor. Talk to them. And then the biggest thing I think is the witness in challenging times. There's going to be another 08, 09. The question is are you financially ready for that? Are you spiritually ready for that? And emotionally ready for that? The church shows up at disasters. That's when we're our best. That's what I didn't see in 08, 09. And that's what I want to see, for us to be there. Thank you.